I'm Eileen Alfandary. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day, and welcome to Letters and Politics for Thursday, January 16th, 2014. I'm Mitch Jeserich. On Tuesday of this week, the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, D.C. ruled in a case brought by the telecommunication company Verizon that the Federal Communications Commission illegally instituted its open internet policies in 2010 that assured net neutrality, in which all websites are treated equally by internet providers such as Verizon and Comcast. Open internet activists fear that the ruling could be a major step away from an open and free internet. Well, to talk about more on this case, as well as the issues surrounding a free and open internet, I'm joined by Craig Aaron. Craig Aaron is the president of Free Press. He joins me from Washington, D.C. Craig, I thank you greatly for taking time and joining us today.
Great to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
Craig, what is net neutrality?
Net neutrality is a fundamental principle that's been part of the internet since its inception. It basically means no discrimination. Net neutrality is what ensures when you go online, you can go wherever you want, do whatever you want, download whatever you want. And it's not up to your internet service provider, your phone or your cable company, to decide which websites are going to work and which ones won't.
Now, what the D.C. Circuit Court did on Tuesday, I'm seeing many articles saying the internet is dead. R.I.P. the internet. Is that exactly the case? I look at one article that you have here that you wrote, Craig Aaron. It says, does this ruling mean the end of the internet? You say maybe.
I don't think the internet is dead yet, but I think it might be on life support.
And what do we mean by dead? I mean, clearly it's still going to exist.
Sure. I think we mean the free and open internet as we've known it. The impact of this court ruling is that the Federal Communications Commission, the government agency that's supposed to protect internet users and oversee communications networks, is no longer able to stop a company like AT&T or Verizon or Time Warner Cable from blocking websites, from interfering with or manipulating traffic to favor their own sites and services or those of their financial partners. They're taking this amazing environment for free speech and democratic participation and economic innovation and potentially turning it into something that looks a lot more like cable television, where a few big companies pick and choose the channels for you. That's never been the way the internet has worked, but when you lose these fundamental protections, that's very much what could happen. And it's really an even bigger shame, I think, because the court decision itself, of course, doesn't say net neutrality is a bad idea or we shouldn't have policies to protect internet users or keep the free and open internet. What the court says in their ruling is basically that the way the FCC made its rules is wrong, that they don't have the authority to do it. But the secret of the story is that the whole reason the FCC doesn't have the authority, the whole reason we're in this mess, is because the FCC itself abdicated its authority. They gave it up. And back during the Bush administration, they changed the way that broadband networks were treated under the law, and that has created this confusion and all of this legal wrangling. And the good news is the FCC could fix that problem, but thus far they haven't. And what the court is saying is all these ways they've tried to protect the internet, stitched together, watered down rules and half measures, that those just aren't going to fly.
So two important time periods here. One in 2010 when the FCC made the rule change to enforce net neutrality, if I understand correctly, and that's what the court said that the FCC violated.
That's
was
right.
That 2010 decision to enforce net neutrality, and it's because of another thing the FCC did about 10 years ago when Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell,
right,
was the chair of the FCC. So in this timeline, first, exactly what happened 10 years ago?
Let me walk you through it a little bit and appreciate the time to do so. We don't always get that. But basically what happened is you can go all the way back to the last time the Communications Act, which is the law that governs all of our communications networks, was rewritten. It was 1996. And that's a piece of legislation that a lot of people know about because it really destroyed local radio, really increased ownership of corporate ownership of local radio and television, but some parts of the bill were about these internet networks, and those parts were actually pretty good. They set out a competitive structure, but what happened is the way things used to be is that our telephone networks were always treated as what's called a common carrier, just like roads or railroads. Essentially, there's one pipe, or at most two pipes going into your house. And because it's a common carrier, it means that the people who control those pipes, the gatekeepers, don't get to dictate what goes over them. So just like
it's like a utility.
Yeah, like a utility, but I think or a bridge. Yeah. You know, you might be able to charge a toll to get on the bridge, but you don't get to tell people what kind of car they can drive. This is law that goes back centuries, and it's very important in telecommunications networks. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because we fought a lot of battles a long time ago to make sure that AT&T, which was the phone monopoly, couldn't do things like stop people from using answering machines. Eventually, this is what opened up the market so that you had a choice of long-distance service providers. So instead of long-distance being this incredibly expensive thing, suddenly there was Sprint and MCI and all these companies, and the prices came down. We saw the same thing with dial-up internet access. You had 8, 9, 10 different choices, local choices, big companies, different kinds of plans. This is all because the main company, the phone company, was required to share their lines. This has always been part of telecommunications law, but when broadband came along, cable companies got in the broadband business, and the cable companies didn't want to have those same rules apply to them. They were traditionally governed under a different part of the law, known as Title VI, and they never had to share their wires. All they were doing was, spitting out content at you. But here they're suddenly becoming an internet service provider. They went to the Michael Powell and the Bush FCC, and they said, we don't want to be a common carrier. We don't want to be treated that way. And the Bush FCC said, okay. We'll just change the rules for you. You don't have to be. Your internet service is not a telecommunication service or a transmission service anymore. We're going to call it an information service, just like a website. And
have we had information service category before?
Yeah, we did. So there's 6 parts of the Telecommunications Act, and the first part is information services, which is traditionally things like websites, the Free Press website, the KPFA website,
the actual website itself,
web services like LexisNexis or other things, things traveling over the internet, not the internet service providers who actually control the pipes. They were traditionally in Title II, and cable television was over in Title VI, and there's things about other long-distance telephone service and other things that are sort of less important now. But so they changed the way it was treated under the law, and they did that. They got sued. It was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court in 2005. It was called the Brand X case, and there were some withering dissents in this case, including one by Anson and Scalia, who couldn't believe the FCC was trying to change how the networks were being treated, believe it or not. But ultimately, the court ruled not that this was a good policy, but that it was up to the FCC. They're the expert agency. They can do what they want. So all of a sudden, what had traditionally been a telecommunication service was an information service. And the phone company said, well, wait a second. If you're letting the cable guys off the hook, you have to let us off the hook as well. And the FCC, now under the next chairman, went ahead and did that. So suddenly, these networks that had been regulated in one way forever, that had started this amazing revolution that is the internet, suddenly that was all gone. And one of the real dangers of the change is that part of being a telecommunication service is really strong protections against discrimination. Net neutrality was effectively baked into the law, but that law no longer applied. And this was the fight we were having back in 2005, 2006, 2007 to try to recodify net neutrality under the law. And you had the phone companies saying, fighting very hard against that, cable companies fighting hard against that, and that sort of started this whole big net neutrality debate. In the meantime, the FCC did try to rein in the worst behavior. So when Comcast got caught blocking lawful file sharing, Free Press filed a complaint with the FCC. And surprisingly, under a Republican administration, 2008, the FCC actually took action, and they sanctioned Comcast for illegally blocking the internet. Comcast sued the FCC, saying they lacked the authority. And the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 2010 agreed with Comcast, saying the FCC didn't apply the rules correctly. This came in the middle of an attempt by the FCC to write new open internet rules. And at that juncture, once this court had ruled in saying you can't do it this other way you've been trying to do it, we went to the FCC and a lot of our allies and said, please, Obama FCC, the courts are telling you can't do net neutrality in this roundabout way. You have to go back in and do what's called reclassifying broadband. And all that simply means is reverse what the Bush administration did.
Get these providers out of the category of information services.
These are not websites. We do not want the FCC in there trying to look at content. What we want them to do is protect us against abuse by the phone and cable monopoly. They absolutely need to be part of Title II. They've always been part of Title II, and everybody who looks at this says, well, obviously these are common carrier networks. They always have been.
And then and is that the classification, then being a common carrier network?
I'm sorry, that is the same thing as Title II and common carrier networks are synonymous.
And then they can be regulated, say, the way you regulate the phone companies.
Exactly, where the key policies generally being either open access, in other words, you have to share your pipes in some way, although there are lighter touch versions where you just say, look, you can't interfere with the content going over the pipes. Your job is to provide the pipes. You're going to be compensated very handsomely. I'm going to pay you my $60, $70, $80 a month to get high-speed internet service. But once I get in line, you don't have anything to say about how the content works. That's what they should have done. Instead, what the Obama FCC under Chairman Julius Genachowski did is they tried to go back with this same sort of flawed approach and this information services approach, claiming they had authority under some other sections of the law. And that's what the court rejected this week. They said, you can't do it. If you want to stop blocking on the internet, if you want to stop discrimination on the internet, those are what are called, in the legal parlance, common carrier obligations. So you just told us, you're telling the court these aren't common carriers, and yet you're trying to apply common carrier style rules. So this whole fiction the FCC tried to create just doesn't work legally. So even though some of their intentions were okay, wasn't particularly satisfied with the rules they made, but they offered some important protections. The courts are saying you just can't do it this way. And it's very clear in this decision, as it's written, they lay a very clear path that says, FCC, if you want to protect the internet this way, if you want to prevent blocking, then you have to go back and look at how broadband is classified under the law. It's a very clear path. The challenge is, does the leadership of the FCC, we're now under another new FCC chair, a guy named Tom Wheeler, who just started a few months ago, does he have the political will to actually take on this fight and challenge the big companies? His predecessor didn't have it. He wasn't willing to stand up to these companies, and we are now seeing the results of that, which is a world in which the Federal Communications Commission has no oversight over the communications networks of the 21st century and can't do anything if one of these companies decides to start blocking websites, discriminating against content. They actually don't have any any rules or any tools to enforce them.
Again, we are in conversation with Craig Aaron. Craig Aaron is the president of Free Press, and we are talking about the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals decision concerning the FCC and its rulings over net neutrality. So, Craig Aaron, it sounds like your concern isn't really with the court ruling. It's more with how the FCC came to the decision and the process it used to address net neutrality.
I think the blame ultimately rests with the FCC. I mean, I'm not a fan of the court ruling, and I think there were better ways the judges could have done it, and I think they took a very sweeping approach that they didn't necessarily have to do. But there's no question in my mind that this mess is the FCC's fault and Verizon's fault. If these phone companies did the things they pretend they're doing and tell us how much they could trust them, then they wouldn't be spending so much time lobbying and suing the Federal Communications Commission. But there's no question that the FCC's failure to heed the warning of groups like Free Press and so many others that they were creating a mess by approaching net neutrality this way, that's definitely come home to roost in this court decision.
So the push that you're now involved in is trying to get the FCC to reclassify these internet providers as
it's Title II of the Communications Act. It's called reclassifying broadband. That is the action we want the Federal Communications Commission to take, and they have the power to do it. This is the quickest and cleanest way to address this problem and make sure that there is some last resort for internet users if they are being abused by their internet service providers.
How easy is it for the FCC to do that? If they didn't do it in 2010, and since the change about 10 years ago, How easy? I mean, is it just as easy as a majority of the members on the FCC board?
Well, they do have the power, so the FCC could start a proceeding, and if a majority of the FCC voted to do this, that was how they took it away, and that's what they could do to put it back. So the sort of the technicalities are that easy now. The politics aren't that simple. Anything they do, they're very likely to be sued again, but they would be on much stronger legal footing. And there's a lot of pressure, both from the phone and cable company lobby, which is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, and a lot of members of Congress, pressuring them not to do this, because they don't want to hear from their supporters at AT&T and Verizon and Time Warner Cable and everybody else, that the FCC has done this. But the thing about this court decision, it's so clear and it's so sweeping that I don't see how the FCC has any choice if it's going to have any relevance. If there's going to be any hope of an agency being able to stand up for the public and protect internet users, they have to move toward reclassification. Any other proposed half measures or kind of dealing with the scraps of authority that the court left them simply aren't good enough. For example, the FCC still has some transparency powers. They can force some of these companies to tell you what they're doing, but they can't actually force them to stop doing it, which is pretty cold comfort. So I think this is something the FCC needs to look at very closely and carefully. Congress may get involved. You know, right now Congress isn't particularly known for doing things like passing legislation, so I think that's a much longer road. I think the clear best choice, the clear best response is to recognize that this structure put in place during the Bush years under Chairman Powell, who incidentally is now the top head lobbyist for the cable industry, but that
wasn't Tom Wheeler lobbying for the cable industry as well before?
He in fact
who is now the chair?
The current chair, the old chair has the current chair's old job, if that makes sense. Welcome to Washington. But here's the thing. I mean, we don't know exactly what Tom Wheeler is going to do. His resume suggests, yes, he was a high-powered lobbyist. He said some things during his time in the job. He was in Oakland just a couple of weeks ago saying some very good things about the importance of an open internet, going out and meeting with the public. He said some other things in other speeches, I think, that suggest that he doesn't fully understand the stakes here. So, like any issue in Washington, the difference is going to come from how much noise does the public make? How involved are they? If the public isn't heard on this, if they don't make themselves heard on this, we won't get reclassification. We won't get these kind of changes. And I know we just went probably, hopefully people stayed with us through the long discussion of FCC jurisprudence, but I think that the key is what we've seen happen on so many of these issues. Net neutrality, the first time it came around, and stopping Congress from passing a bill that didn't include it. The fight against the web censorship bills, SOPA and PIPA. The incredible public response to unchecked spying and surveillance, which has fundamentally shifted that debate. We've seen that when people mobilize, when they engage and get involved, it changes the terms of the debate. So I don't think Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the FCC, is ready today to make this move. But I don't think it's been completely ruled out either. So that's where, public engagement and public involvement can still make a real difference, and where conversations like this, where we can begin to talk about what the real stakes are for anybody using the internet, for anybody wanting to keep control of how they use the internet, from anybody putting out independent content or dissident views. If you're doing that kind of work, you absolutely don't want to be having to go to a Verizon or an AT&T or a Comcast or a Time Warner Cable and ask for permission, or ask whether they'll let you into the express lane, because they obviously won't. So there's a lot at stake here. It does get wonky and complicated pretty quickly. Unfortunately, like so many important things that happen in Washington, the devil is very much in the details.
Verizon, who brought this case, put out a statement saying that it doesn't, in light of the ruling, doesn't have any plans to immediately do anything to affect net neutrality. It also said that it does support an open and free internet. People who oppose net neutrality rules that have been imposed so far say that before those rules came in, before 2010, the internet was an open and free place, and that these type of rules really were unnecessary.
Well, I think we have to go back a little. I have a couple answers to that. And one is, of course, this debate has been happening, and with all these companies very engaged in this debate, spending millions of dollars to lobby in this debate, the last thing they wanted to do was get caught with some kind of major violation, because that would obviously speed the making of rules. We saw that with Comcast. They ultimately won in court, but the fact that they were caught illegally blocking BitTorrent and stopping people from sharing things like the Bible went really badly for them. And so a lot of companies have been on their best behavior. So what I look at is, what are they saying when they're not in front of the politicians and they're not in front of the press? What do they say when they go to their trade shows? What do they say when they're testifying in court? And what they say time and time again is, we want to reserve the right to block. We want to reserve the right to discriminate. They were very.
Is that exactly what they say?
In court, Verizon's lawyer was asked directly if they intended to discriminate, and she said yes. Now, do they look at it that way? No, they look at it, well, we're cutting special deals. They want to find ways where some of these other companies, the Netflixes and things of the world, will pay them extra to reach their customers. They would like to mess around with the algorithms and the ports and all the things that are in the back end of the internet to favor certain speeds and content.
But let me ask you this: if you look at Netflix, I could see an argument in a capitalist system that we do live in, that if you are Netflix and you have a lot of traffic and you're using a lot of bandwidth on the lines and using resources, that perhaps Netflix should pay more.
And here's the thing, though, they do. Netflix doesn't pay $80 a month to get online. Netflix pays millions and millions of dollars to get its content out to the internet, where it meets up with these phone and cable companies. And you and I pay our $50, $60, $70, $80 a month so we can get that content and whatever other content we want. The problem is, when you put one of these gatekeepers in place, when you get rid of net neutrality, suddenly they're in a position to decide who gets to go in the fast lane. They're in a position to decide for you, well, I'm sure you'd like to watch a movie, but you can watch the pre-selected movies from Verizon. Those are going to be available in HD. But if you'd like to watch these independent films, or you'd like to watch Netflix, yeah, you could do that too, but there is going to be a lot of buffering, and that little pinwheel is going to spin, and eventually consumers are going to give up on that unless people pay in. And the problem is it cuts off what makes the internet so great. Because the beauty of the internet is that if you have a good idea, if you have something original to say, you don't need the permission to go and find an audience. You can actually just put it out there, and that's what we're all paying for. That's what the hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars these phone and cable companies are making. It's because we're paying them to get access to all of that good stuff, not the pre-selected good stuff that they decide is good. And that's the way the internet's always worked. And these companies are making so much money. Cable companies make 80, 90% profits off of your internet product, your cable modem product. They could be investing in their networks instead of trying to profit from artificial scarcity and finding new ways to double dip and double charge people, getting money from the customer and then trying to get extra money from these companies. And fear not, if they get away with this, the people who will end up paying are going to be you and I, because our prices for Netflix, our prices for all these other services, we like YouTube, things we want to use
It'll be passed
online,
on.
We're going to end up having to pay.
Yeah, that's going to be passed on. As we move to wrap up here, Craig, Aaron, is it speed then that we're really talking about here, in the ability and how fast you can download or access or stream?
Yeah, I think speed and quality is hugely important. I think that will be, obviously as our experience, you go to a website now and it doesn't load, you probably don't go back because you could go a million other places.
So it's not like certain websites wouldn't be allowed to exist or that you couldn't get to them at all. They would just be much harder to access.
I think that's the most likely way it's applied, but the problem with the result of this court ruling is there's also nothing stopping them from blocking certain sites. If they don't like a site where there's union organizing going on, they could block it, and you might not even know it was being blocked, right?
So they could just straight block it. That you wouldn't be able to find it, say, if Comcast...
No protection stopping them from doing that. Would public shaming in some cases help them? Sure, it could, but there'd be no cop on the beat who could say, you absolutely have to stop doing that. There's nothing stopping them doing things that we've seen them already do. So cutting off lawful file sharing, that's something Comcast did, where they pretended to be other computers to cut off transmissions of things people were trying to share. It took computer engineers to figure out they were doing that. You and I would never know it was happening. There's nothing to stop them from creating crazy plans if you want to access certain kinds of content where you sort of get internet light, like, oh, here's our corporate partners, you can get that for free, but if you want to get to this other content, well, that's going to cost you a lot more. Or forcing you to say, buy a lot of voice minutes if you want to use Skype or FaceTime. AT&T has tried to do that in the past. Without any protections on the books, without the threat of the FCC taking action, there are all kinds of shady and bad behaviors that these companies can begin to engage in. And their vision for the internet is not the free and open internet we've had. It's cable television, where they pick and choose the channels, where there's tiers of service, where they can nickel and dime you like a few cents for updating your Facebook page, or certain charges if you want to watch sports networks and other things like this. It's taking away what's made the internet so great and turning it into this thing we've already had an experience with, which, as we know, hasn't been a place where independent voices can thrive, new voices, new products and services. Because suddenly, if there's no net neutrality, you have to go cut a deal with your AT&T or your Comcast or your Time Warner, and maybe you're looking at a situation where some companies are only available on one network or the other, and suddenly this great thing we've had, the internet, where you can get access to almost everything, disappears.
Craig Aaron is the president of Free Press. He has joined us to talk about this week's ruling concerning net neutrality. Craig Aaron, I thank you greatly for taking time and joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Mitch. Thanks for having me.